There is a bowl
Listen
of rice
close
sitting
now.
on a table in
Our
South
history
Carolina
is in
that
danger
contains
of
more
being
history
forgotten.
than most
Tell us,
museums.
Mama.
You
Not
must
because
carry
the
it
rice is
forward.
old.
Teach your children.
Because the
Don't
knowledge
let it
required
die.
to grow it, to flood the
Thank you,
fields at
Lord,
precisely the
for
right
this
moment in
day.
the tidal
Yes,
cycle,
Lord, we
to read the
praise
soil
your
and the
holy
water in the
name.
season in a
Your
way that
blessings
produces
are
a
upon
harvest
us.
in land that
We
should
lift
not
our
produce
voices
one,
in
traveled
praise.
across the Atlantic Ocean in the minds of enslaved people who were taken specifically because they possessed it. That knowledge is still here. The people who carried it are still here. And the
That's it.
genetics are
Keep
now
the
showing
coil
us
tight,
exactly where the
like
knowledge
this.
came from, in a
Good.
level of
You've got
detail
the
that 3
feel for it.
centuries of
It's harder
historical
than it looks.
documentation never
You've all
managed to
done
provide.
so well.
Thank
The
you.
Gullah Geechee people
All
live
right,
on
now
a narrow
tuck this
corridor of
strand
sea
under.
islands and coastal
Like this,
lowlands
Grandma?
stretching from the Cape Fear
Yes,
River in
that's
North
it. You are
Carolina down
natural.
through South
It's
Carolina,
getting
Georgia,
bigger.
and
It
into
sure
northern
is. You're
Florida.
doing so well.
They have lived there continuously since the 18th century, which makes them unusual.
Good.
But what makes them genuinely extraordinary, what separates them from virtually every other African-descended community in North America, is not simply the fact of their continued presence on that land. It is what they brought with them and refused to let go of. A language. A
Keep the
spiritual
line steady
system.
now.
A cuisine built on specific crops prepared in specific
Good
ways.
harvest this year.
A relationship to the tidal landscape that encodes generations of ecological knowledge. These are not fragments or echoes of an African past. They are functional, living systems that have been operating continuously for over 300 years in a landscape 8,000 miles from where they originated.
Look at the
American
reeds.
slavery was, among many other
We will be
things,
there
a
soon.
systematic machinery of cultural
I've
destruction.
seen a lot in my years.
Families were separated.
But the most important thing is
Languages were
family.
suppressed.
Love
Names
is what
were
carries us
replaced.
through.
Spiritual practices were forbidden or driven underground. The stated and unstated policy of the slave system was to produce people with no usable past, no cultural continuity, no collective identity that might
It's
organize
smelling so
resistance.
good. Almost ready
This
for
policy
these
was
veggies.
enforced with
Don't
violence
forget the
across
okra.
generations.
I'm getting the rice ready.
It worked, to a
Perfect. It's
significant
all coming
degree,
together.
across most of the American South. And yet on the sea islands of coastal South Carolina and Georgia, it did not work. Something was different there. The first explanation that historians offered for this difference was geographic. The sea islands are difficult to reach. The waterways between the barrier islands and the mainland are treacherous for anyone who does not know them. Malaria was endemic in the coastal lowlands, severe enough that European planters and overseers avoided extended residence there whenever possible. The result was a degree of physical separation from the broader white plantation world that did not exist on the tobacco farms of Virginia or the cotton fields of the Mississippi Delta. Left largely to themselves, supervised by black drivers rather than white overseers, Gullah Geechee communities had space to maintain practices that elsewhere were extinguished within a generation or two. Geography created an opening. But geography alone cannot explain what happened inside that opening, and this is where the story becomes genuinely unusual. Because what the Gullah Geechee preserved was not a generic African cultural memory. It was something specific. Precise. Identifiable. When linguists analyze the grammar of Gullah Creole, the language spoken across these communities, they do not find a generic West African influence. They find structural patterns that trace directly to specific language families concentrated in Sierra Leone, Guinea, and the Senegambia region. When ethnobotanists examine the Gullah food traditions, the crops, the preparation methods, the knowledge of which plants grow where and how to use them, they find a tradition rooted not in West Africa broadly but in the specific agricultural ecology of the Rice Coast. When scholars of African religious practice examine the Gullah spiritual system, they find Yoruba, Mende, and Congo structural elements so specific that they cannot be explained as the general residue of African cultural memory. They point to particular communities, particular traditions, particular places. The question this raises is not simply why the culture survived. The question is why it survived this specifically. And that is the question the genetics have begun to answer. When researchers from the Family Tree DNA African Ancestry Project and associated institutions began mapping haplogroup distributions in Gullah Geechee communities in the 2010s with the higher resolution that modern genomic techniques allow, they found something that separated the Gullah Geechee data from virtually every other African American population sample they had analyzed. The haplogroup clustering in Gullah Geechee communities was unusually tight. Not simply West African in its broad contours, as African American genetic data generally is, but concentrated in specific lineages that today are found primarily in the Sierra Leone and Senegambia coastal regions. More specifically, the degree of shared ancestry within the community pointed not just to a shared regional origin but to shared origins at the level of specific communities within that region. Many Gullah Geechee individuals appear to share common ancestors not at the scale of a broad ethnic group but at the scale of specific villages, specific family networks, specific communities that were drawn on repeatedly by the transatlantic slave trade because they possessed something the trade wanted. This is where the historical record and the genetic record begin to confirm each other with unexpected precision. In the early 18th century, the colonial economy of coastal South Carolina faced a problem that its European founders had not anticipated. The sea islands and coastal lowlands of the Carolina Low Country were ideally suited, in terms of rainfall and soil chemistry and tidal geography, for the cultivation of rice. Specifically for the cultivation of Oryza glaberrima, the African rice variety, which requires a particular kind of knowledge to grow. Knowledge of how to manage tidal floodwaters. Knowledge of soil preparation in coastal marsh conditions. Knowledge of the specific ecological relationships between rice cultivation and the broader lowland environment. This was not knowledge that European farmers possessed. It was not knowledge that could be read from a book or inferred from first principles. It was embodied knowledge, accumulated over generations in the rice-growing communities of West Africa's coast, and it existed nowhere else. What the planters of colonial South Carolina did, with a commercial ruthlessness that the historical record documents with some precision, was to specifically seek out enslaved people from the rice coast. They paid premiums. They communicated preferences to their agents in the slave trade. They sought people from Sierra Leone, from Guinea, from the Senegambia specifically, because those were the people who knew the rice. The result was something the planters had not planned for. By selecting so specifically for a particular regional origin, they inadvertently created on the sea islands a community that was not the random multi-ethnic mix that characterized most American slave populations. It was something closer to a concentrated cultural transplant. People who shared language families. People who shared spiritual traditions. People who shared agricultural knowledge so specific and so technical that the enslaving system was forced to allow them to organize and communicate and teach each other, because the system needed what they knew and what they knew could only be transmitted in community. The DNA is now showing the biological dimension of what the cultural record had already been suggesting. This was not a community assembled randomly from the broad population of enslaved West Africans. It was a community drawn repeatedly and specifically from a narrow geographic and ethnic corridor, and that specificity shows up in the haplogroup data as an unusual degree of genetic clustering that distinguishes Gullah Geechee communities from every other African American population in the database. The knowledge that made them targets for enslavement became the mechanism of their cultural survival. Because the planters needed the rice to grow, they needed the people who knew the rice to remain functional as a community. They needed them to speak to each other, to organize the work, to train the next generation. And in creating those conditions for their own economic benefit, they created the conditions within which one of the most remarkable acts of cultural continuity in the history of the Atlantic world became possible. There is something in this that resists simple summary. The Gullah Geechee story is not a story of passive survival. It is not the story of a people who simply held on because the geography gave them a little more room than enslaved people elsewhere were given. It is the story of a people who actively maintained and transmitted a specific body of knowledge across 3 centuries because that knowledge was real, functional, and irreplaceable, and because they understood, in ways that did not require articulation, that as long as they held the knowledge they held something that the system around them could not afford to simply destroy. The rice farmers who came from Sierra Leone and Guinea knew things that the colonial economy needed. They knew how to manage tidal gates in coastal marshland. They knew which soils would hold water and which would drain. They knew the specific timing of the flooding cycle, when to let the water in and when to draw it off, calibrated to the growth stages of the plant in ways that no European agricultural tradition had ever developed. This was expert knowledge. Professional knowledge. The kind of knowledge that in any other context would have been recognized as a skilled trade and compensated accordingly. In the context of the Atlantic slave trade, it was recognized only as something to extract. But extraction has a paradox built into it. You cannot extract knowledge by destroying the people who carry it. You cannot take the rice tradition from the rice farmers by severing every connection between them. The knowledge was not in books. It was not in written records. It was in practice, in community, in the specific relationships between people who had grown up watching the same fields and learning from the same elders. To get the rice, the planters had to allow the community to function. And a functioning community, even an enslaved one, is a community that can maintain language and spiritual practice and food tradition and ecological knowledge across generations. This is the paradox that produced the Gullah Geechee culture as we know it. Not kindness. Not accident. Not simply geography. But the internal logic of a system that needed something specific and could only get it by allowing the people who possessed it to remain, in the ways that mattered most, themselves. The rice is still grown on the Sea Islands. The Gullah language is still spoken by thousands of people for whom it is a living first language rather than a heritage artifact. The food traditions are still practiced in kitchens that have been cooking the same dishes in the same ways for 10 generations. The spiritual system is still alive in forms that scholars have traced directly to specific West African traditions. And when DNA researchers bring ancestry results to Gullah Geechee elders today and show them the haplogroup maps pointing to the Sierra Leone and Guinea coastal region, the response is not surprise. It is recognition. A recognition that travels in both directions, from the science toward the community and from the community back toward the science, confirming what the community always carried as knowledge and what the science is only now developing the tools to read. 300 years after the crossing. 8,000 miles from the origin. The knowledge is still here. And the DNA is finally showing us exactly where here actually is, and how it got there, and what it cost the people who carried it across an ocean in the only place that could not be searched or seized or taken from them. In their minds. In their hands. In the specific way they knew to read the water.